Welcome to Unit 8, the Cold War through Contemporary Issues. You can see here in this cartoon, this is a collage of all the events that we'll be covering, or most of the events we'll be covering through the Cold War. At the end of World War II, you can see here's FDR, of course there's Joseph Stalin. Red and blue that you see on each, blue representing democracy, you have red representing communists, you have Mikhail Gorbachev and Khrushchev, Harry Truman, the space race. What started, I guess, to show each person's strength, each country's strength, was nuclear war. Here's Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can see Vietnam written here. Of course, the Warsaw Pact and NATO, which we'll talk about briefly. Beginning with section 8.1, background information on the Cold War. So, of course, you see a lot of red over here and a lot of blue. The dark blue represents the NATO organization, NATO members. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and is basically having each other's back for democracy. The light blue countries are Western aligned, so they agree pretty much with democratic principles, but they're not quite in NATO. Again, you have the dark red on the other side, which represents the Warsaw Pact and the USSR and its states, and the light red, which means it's USSR aligned. Of course, Africa, you can see a lot of it has colonies that are now up for grabs, and these two different principles, democracy and communism, will be stretching out to essentially spread their influence on each of these colonies and these neutral places also. These places where maybe Egypt and India, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, places where European countries had to back away. Some background information before we jump into the Cold War. You remember that Nazi Germany lost World War II, and much of Europe was in ruins. Remember, a lot of the fighting took place in Europe. Yes, there was some fighting that took place in the Pacific, of course, but we're going to be focusing specifically on Europe in the next two sections. The United Nations had been created. It replaced the League of Nations, which was a failed organization. Remember, the U.S. did not join the League of Nations. The Senate rejected it, and Woodrow Wilson's dream had failed, but later on, the United Nations was formed, and it was formed right after the Holocaust. They didn't want to see genocides and wars ever happen again. You can see here on this political cartoon to the right, this is what we call an arms race. You have the Soviet Union on one side and you have democracy on the other. There's two ideologies, of course, democracy with the US and communism with the Soviet Union, the USSR. These are the two superpowers which are now competing for their government beliefs to spread through the world. And what's crazy is both of these countries were allies at one point while they were defeating Hitler and the Nazis. But following World War II, it's almost as if two superstars can't play on the same, sports team. So, because there's only one person who can shoot the basket or whatnot. So, there was a lot of conflict and there's a lot of issues. An arms race, which is one of your important vocab words, is where they build up weaponry, kind of to show their muscles, to show their strength. And so, if one person builds a nuclear warhead, the next person will, and this eventually leads to an extreme amount of dangerous weapons in the world. And that's pretty much where we were for the next 40 years or so, and since we've digressed a little bit. So what did each of these countries want? The Soviets wanted security. They believed communism was a superior economic system. Remember, Karl Marx started communism. They felt threatened by capitalist countries, and because Germany had destroyed so much of the Soviet Union, they wanted Germany to stay weak and to be severely punished for World War II. We, on the other hand, had kind of learned from World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, which punished Germany too harshly, that this could lead up to another totalitarian dictator. Of course, communism is associated with totalitarianism in a sense. Now, let's jump to the right-hand side where Americans wanted to focus on the economic problems. They believed the Great Depression caused World War II and allowed Hitler to rise to power. They thought capitalism, this free enterprise, free trade, democracy, the ability to have private property and limited government would help lead to economic prosperity. And of course, democracy and the free market are aligned with the UK, France, and the United States' view of thinking.
So they met in February 1945 before the war officially ended. FDR was still in office before he passed. FDR, Churchill, and Stalin met at Yalta to discuss what the world would look like after World War II. Here's some of the issues they discussed. What do we do with Poland? All right. It's original non-government, and now, they had fought over that a little bit. They didn't know, should it be reinstated as a communist government, or should they be allowed to be democratic? The U.S., even though they are pro-democracy, they allowed Poland to be communist if it was written in law that Poland would be allowed to have free elections in the next few years. Now, they also had a declaration of liberated Europe. These are the major powers, and they wanted Europe to be able to choose what form of government each European country wanted. So if Yugoslavia or Czechoslovakia wanted one way and Germany wanted another way, we would start to see countries choose their own liking. These are the big three: Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. And they agreed to divide Germany, which we'll talk about briefly, east and west. So here you have a political cartoon. You can see traditionally a stork, a graceful bird, would be carrying a beautiful baby. In this case, it's a vulture representing communism who is carrying chaos for the future, who cannot fix the problems with this simple monkey wrench. On the other hand, you have a doctor, well educated, driving an industrialized car, showing wealth, driving to the house called Western Europe down a long and windy road, fixing their problems for the long term, not creating chaos. From this cartoon alone, you can see that the artist was simply pro-democratic. So again, here's a political cartoon of the two superpowers. Here you have FDR and Stalin. They're playing chess because it's a complicated game and it involves strategy. But if you look closely, you will see that the faces of the chess pieces are actually leaders of other countries. So in a sense, they're playing with other countries to figure out how the world is going to look like after World War II. We will be doing these Freyer models and of communism and democracy much later, and we will be doing some activities also. Thus far, what have we discussed? The effects of World War II, Yalta Conference, communism, democracy, what capitalism, free enterprise look like. We've also seen a divide between blue and red. Naturally, countries started to choose what favored them, and you will see that there's a line down the middle, kind of a line down the middle, and we call that the Iron Curtain. Curtains often divide rooms, okay? And so we call this the Iron Curtain. It was not a physical curtain, it was not a physical wall, but it was an ideological divide. Two ways of thinking about how the world should be. And now you have blue, democratic democracy, and red representing communist countries. We discussed who the big three were: Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt. The Declaration of Liberated Europe, where countries are able to choose which ideology they have, and the United Nations, which replaced the League of Nations and was intended to prevent future genocides. Before we move forward, let's look at what the Potsdam Conference was. 1 month before World War II ended, the dropping of the atomic bombs, you see that Truman wanted to rebuild Germany, the German economy, so it did not fall to communism. The Soviets, of course, wanted to hurt Germany, and they dismissed the Declaration of Liberated Europe. They thought it was garbage. They, of course, met at Potsdam, Germany. Germany was the focus of World War II, so it would be the focus of the post-war world. Here's the agreement. The U.S. eventually accepted the Soviets' new border with Poland. Stalin accepted the German economy to be rebuilt as long as they got some reparations, which are payments for the damages. The tension steadily increased between the two superpowers, as was shown in the political cartoon a few slides back. Here's what the Iron Curtain looks like. Of course, this is a political cartoon. You have Winston Churchill looking under, trying to see this industrialized Russian economy, which is building. No admittance, which means no entrance, by order of Joe, referring to Joseph Stalin. Again, this is a cartoon, but it shows it divides Europe, and they have guards, which shows they are willing to use military force. And of course, you have people wondering what is going on over there. Communism, dictatorship, 1948. He installed the pro-Soviet communist government throughout Eastern Europe. Referring to the Iron Curtain, you'll see this political cartoon. I'll move it over to a bigger picture. Here you have the U.S., you have this short little guy, and you have this old guy. That's the U.S., France, and Britain. And the divide was so intense that they actually asked the United Nations for help. And the United Nations was represented here by a lady, possibly Lady Liberty or a symbol of freedom. And they are saying, you try it, sister. You try to lift this. Remember, the Iron Curtain was not a physical thing. This is just a play on words. And it's a way of characterizing it. The Iron Curtain was an ideological divide between Eastern and Western Europe, between democracy and communism. So with each of those, you have rival organizations which have now come up. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. April 1949, an agreement happened to unite the democratic countries. They agreed to help any ally who was attacked. I got your back, you got my back. West Germany eventually joined NATO. On the other hand, the Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact. And I like this political cartoon a lot. You see the arms race with each, and kind of like, you know, a little girl would pick a flower. Does he love me? Does he not? They are picking a dove, the symbol of peace, holding the olive branch. War, peace, war, peace. And this eventually could possibly lead to a World War III or a global nuclear conflict. So the Cold War did divide the world. NATO, Warsaw Pact, large military forces, 50 years of tensions, and the world was holding its breath, essentially. Here's a map. Now, I always like to use blue when I look at the NATO and the democratic countries. In this case, they use green, but you get the point. Here is the Soviet Union and its communist countries, the Warsaw Pact. Here's NATO, and these countries, Yugoslavia even, are still remaining neutral. We'll see what they end up doing later. So why are tensions so elevated? Nuclear war. Of course, we saw what the atomic bomb did. The Soviets were working on their atomic bomb, and we realized, you know, we could actually destroy the world, the face of the earth. All of humanity could be wiped out. So that's why the tensions were so high. We didn't want them to do anything. We didn't even want us to have to get to that point, but they didn't want us to do anything either. So now let's start with 8.2 and focus specifically on Europe during the Cold War. Again, we see that there's a blue and a red divide. The Western Bloc representing communism, Yugoslavia has now joined that, and the Eastern Bloc. And you can see the Iron Curtain pretty much separates the two sides. Now, there's always going to be, you know, some confusion here and there, but I just want you to know that the Iron Curtain is an ideological divide between both communism and democracy. Now, if you can remember from the previous unit, they also divided Germany, they being the Soviets and the democratic countries, France, Britain, and the U.S. So Germany is now divided into 4 zones. One zone is communist, and 3 of the zones are democratic. West Germany is democratic and divided between American, British, and French. The East Germany is controlled solely by the Soviets. The Iron Curtain is separated Eastern and Western Europe as the Cold War began, and the Iron Curtain runs straight through Germany. So here's Germany, and what's interesting about this is that if you look over here at Berlin, Berlin is the heart of Germany. Berlin is also the capital. So the Western allies, France, Britain, and the UK, they did not want to just let Berlin go, but so they worked out an agreement where they also divided Berlin, but we'll later see how Berlin is now trapped. Western Berlin is trapped inside this red territory, inside East Germany. West Germany is officially called the Federal Republic of Germany. It's not allowed to have a military. Remember, the Nazis had just left power, but it was independent. It was democratic, and therefore it held elections. And because it embraced democracy, it received the Marshall Plan. You may remember the Marshall Plan from last unit, but the Marshall Plan we will be discussing in this section. East Germany is, of course, communist, and it's part of the Warsaw Pact. The Berlin Wall. Now, do not get the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall mixed up. So let's fast forward a few years. Early 1961, as many as 1,000 people a day left East Germany communism for a better life in the capitalist West. I'm going to show this map again, so I'm going to go back one slide. So here you have East Germans, and they see the opportunity that that blue side of Berlin has. Remember, the western side of Berlin is also divided, and it has capitalistic opportunities. It has democracy. It has places. So all of those communist citizens started running into the democratic area, saying, "We want a part of this. We want a part of this," and that kind of embarrassed Stalin. So he ended up putting a Berlin Wall. Western media reports about this exodus, and the Eastern state-controlled media ignored it. You know, they didn't want to get in trouble for reporting the fact that East Berliners and East Germans were leaving the communist territory. East Berliners can see their neighbors leaving, and the migration continues. So he built this wall, he being Stalin. All right, August 13th, 1961, East German government throws up a 27-mile wall, first by barbed wire, and later by they finished it by stone, and they said it's to protect the citizens from capitalism, as if capitalism is something evil to fear. Telephone lines and mail between east and west were cut, and it was hard for families, you know, maybe one person lived on one side and the other, and these families now had a wall that divided them. There was no internet, there was no Facebook, there was no email that they could, and there was no cell phone. So just simply calling or seeing or FaceTiming a relative could have been impossible for almost 30 years at this point. Berlin Wall went up in 1961. You have the Russian Nikita Khrushchev. I'm sorry, I said Stalin earlier. It was Khrushchev. Khrushchev wanted the East Germans to stop immigrating to the West. Khrushchev wanted the U.S., UK, and France to withdraw from the West. West Berlin, of course, being the heartbeat of Germany, we were not having that. Kennedy said no, and Khrushchev built the wall. This is a modern-day picture of the wall. You got to remember, back in the day, there was German guards, East German guards, that would shoot you if you tried to spray paint. But this is a present-day picture of the Berlin Wall. And remember, it was to prevent them from the effects of capitalism, to prevent them from getting out. So here's some of the early stages of the wall. People tried to escape after the wall was built, some with car. This is like one of the first, first stages of the wall. So it was just simply a fence, but with a little bit of barbed wire. So, but I don't want you to think this was just the wall. Later, stone took place to make the wall go up. Tunnel escape. People had to actually go underground in order to escape from the East Germany or East Berlin. The influence today is a symbol of art. There's still pieces of it standing, although the wall is broken. They left some just as a symbol, just for tourist attraction, and it was the symbol of communism. Let's look at divided Berlin. Of course, you have on the left side, the western side, you have the French, British, and Americans working cooperatively, and then towards the right, you have the Soviet zone, which was occupied by communism. And you start to see these little airplanes, and we're going to talk about this in a second, where since this was surrounded by all of this communist territory, how did it get supplies? How did it get food? How did it get medical necessities? Actually, planes had to come in, and planes had to drop off items to keep West Berlin alive. So here is the Soviet animal. Ours in the United States is the bald eagle. Theirs is the Russian bear. So, and this is the Russian military hat, the Soviet hat. They are surrounding Berlin. All right, you see the French flag, American, you see the British flag. A few could come in at a time, but eventually this would close, and nobody was allowed to and fro. Nobody was allowed. So because nobody was allowed, they had to do the Berlin airlift. And you can see they had to go in, air, drop supplies off in Western Berlin, and exit, and vice versa from the north, and drop supplies off in West Berlin. And then, now this only happened from June 1948 to April 1949. So it wasn't the entire 28 years the Berlin Wall existed. It was only 11 months. After that, there were political entities which could go to and fro for the necessity of sustaining West Berlin. Now, the Berlin airlift, the fact that we were willing to go that far to drop supplies and medical personnel, I mean, not personnel, but medical attention or medical supplies, the fact that we were willing to go that far for this little part of this little city in Europe surrounded by communist territory became a symbol of American determination. Now, I'm not going to show this video here today, but I want you to go through your Blackboard notes, and inside the blend space, you will see a series of Cold War videos. I encourage you to watch all of those as you're learning this unit. The Berlin airlift. West Germany begins to rule itself out. Soviets hold West Berlin hostage. They cut off land, water, and rail. That is in your notes. Roots in West Berlin. Stalin wanted to starve West Berlin and force the Allies to give up control of West Berlin. Americans and Brits had to fly food and supplies into West Berlin for 11 months. This is a good review. May 1949, Soviets lift the blockade and admit defeat in this particular battle. And when I say battle, please take that lightly because we're in the Cold War. No actual fighting, firing of weapons took place between the Americans and the Soviets. So here's the Berlin airlift. A plane is going to drop off supplies. Now, how are the Americans going to quote-unquote fight communism? We don't want to get into another world war. We had just gotten out of World War II. It had caused tons of drama. It had changed American politics. We were going to fight communism with containment. We wanted to contain communism to where it was. Now, there's two major policies, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Stalin and the Soviet Union didn't want to withdraw from Iran. Britain was helping Greece fight communism. Truman went before Congress and asked for $40 million. In that time, that was even more than it is today to fight communism for Greece and Turkey. We basically bought Greece and Turkey so they would become democratic. And it's hard to remember these two policies, what they're called, but you can think of during a Thanksgiving meal, a true man eats, yes, greasy turkey. Now, the Marshall Plan, on the other hand, was started by Secretary of State George Marshall, proposed as the European Recovery Plan, but now, of course, it's known as the Marshall Plan, named after himself. USSR and the satellite nations rejected the offer. They didn't want to have any part of it. The Marshall Plan donated billions of dollars worth of supplies, machinery, food into Western Europe, so they essentially were buying Western support. And that's how, because of the Marshall Plan, those Western nations joined our democratic democratic ideological thought. Containment. We said containment was described as a long-term, patient but firm, vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. That's the official jargon. Basically, think about like if you spill a red Kool-Aid. And the first thing you do is you try to take a napkin and you move your hand around it so it doesn't spread any further. Then you'll eventually work to clean it up. But the first thing you do is try to stop it from spreading to other parts of the table or what have you. Containment was keeping communism within its present territory through the use of diplomatic or economic military actions. A video on containment, but please watch this first and foremost on your blend space in your Blackboard. Welcome to 8.3. The Cold War is now spreading to Asia. You can see in this map that this unit is going to focus on China, Vietnam, a little bit of Cambodia, and we're eventually going to get over here to the left to Cuba. Red, of course, represents communism. Communism had been very powerful here in the Soviet Union and had been slowly spreading down, including North Korea, which we'll talk about also. First, let's talk about the China-Taiwanese separation. Right here, you see the mainland China, and here below you see the little island of Taiwan. So, there was a revolution in China. Communist leader Mao Zedong captured Beijing, and he moved southward. Mainland China became communist in 1949, just 4 years after World War II. Democratic Forces were led by Chiang Kai-shek. U.S. sent $2 billion to the nationalist government, but they misused the money, and the U.S. eventually stopped sending money to them. So what exactly did Mao do? This is a picture of Mao Zedong. He took over mainland China and he called it the quote-unquote People's Republic of China. He practiced a harsh policy to encourage the Chinese people to embrace communism. What was this harsh policy, you say? Punished, brainwashed, tortured, and killed people, and he called this his cultural revolution. They used red guards, red being communism, remember that, to enforce these policies, and quickly China's economy fell. So here's a picture of the Chinese flag. You can see it's red, kind of sort of looks like the Soviet flag, and red, white, and blue. Here's the blue, represents democracy inside the Taiwanese flag. Here's the results of communism. Soviets and the China had signed a treaty of alliance. They're right next to each other. Why not? Soviets had successfully tested the first atomic bomb. China said, hey, I see that bomb. I'd rather join on your side. The United States only maintained a diplomatic relationship with the Taiwanese nationalists. Japan, now that they had been defeated after World War II, had been occupied by General Douglas MacArthur and had embraced democracy. Their industry and economy had grown and developed, and they had been a shining beacon of defending Asia and democracy in the opposite hemisphere. Let's move over to the Korean War. The Korean War, you see this is a picture from Washington, D.C., the Washington, D.C. Memorial. The Korean War, this is what we call the 38th parallel. So we know of it today as a divided nation. North Korea, run by Kim Jong-un, South Korea as a democratic, freely elected nation. At the end of World War II, the U.S. controlled North Korea while the U.S. controlled South Korea. They were divided at the 38th parallel. So, as the U.S. and USSR rivalry increased, a communist government was formed in North Korea, and likewise, on the contrary, a democratic government in South Korea. Both governments wanted to control all of Korea. Who would only want half of a country? And in June of 1950, the Korean War began. The U.S. and the UN stepped in to help the South, and the Chinese helped the North. Let's go back and look at this map, and I'll show you what does North Korea border? China, completely. Alright, so they thought this would be an opportunity to strengthen their alliance. A stalemate eventually happened, which means they stopped fighting even though the war officially ended. Technically, Korea is still in a state of war today, even though they do not fire weapons back and forth on a day-to-day basis. There's not an actual bloody war going on. It is technically still in a state of war. The political term is called a stalemate, and they divided still at the 38th parallel. So let's do a timeline of the Korean War. Korea was controlled by Japan 1910 to 45. 45, Korea was divided. 50, the North attacked the South. China sent 780,000 troops. That's a lot of people to support. Fighting lasted 3 years, and 33,600 American soldiers died in action. They're often forgotten, and that's why this is sometimes called the Forgotten War. There's so much going on in American politics and society that people often forget about the Korean War. So here's a little bit of a different map. You can see these are advances within the Korean War to and fro. Alright, there's South Korea, here's North Korea, and eventually there's the 38th parallel. That's where they are drawn. The Korean War Memorial is located in D.C. I hope you get the opportunity to go see it and go learn from it. Now let's look at their economies today. You look at this satellite image and you can clearly see their economies. North Korea is not succeeding. Okay, their capital has this one small dot of electricity, and the South Koreans have an expansive amount of electricity. You can see this bright spot right here is Seoul, the capital. This is a satellite map that shows the current use of electricity in the Korean Peninsula. As you can see, which is promotes more opportunity and success, communism or democracy. So I encourage you to check out the blend space videos located on your blackboard. Here's an example that I would show you should I have more time. Unfortunately, with our timing, we don't, so I encourage you to check those out on Blend Space Blackboard. Let's move over to the Vietnam War. Just like North Korea was communist, North Vietnam is also communist, and we support the South. Now, that's a quick preview. Vietnam was once divided. Now, before it was divided, it was united.
In the 1950s, they were very concerned about the spread of communism. They wanted to contain. The French had colonized this area, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and they call this area Indochina. Remember, you have India way down to the south, China to the north. In between, you call it Indochina. Japan took these areas during World War II, and the French eventually regained, but they did not want to be colonized. The people did not want to be colonized by the French, and the French had enough to deal with in rebuilding its own economy after World War II. Let's do a timeline of Vietnam, 1954 to 62. Vietnam was a colony of the French, gained independence. You get the picture. North is communist, south is non-communist. U.S. helps the South Vietnamese by sending money and supplies. They wanted to, quote unquote, contain communism. Containment was our policy. Vietnam, 1962 to 64. Kennedy elected the president in 1960. North Vietnam is still trying to overtake South Vietnam, so the South is basically losing the war. JFK sends more advisors once he's assassinated. LBJ comes in, Lyndon B. Johnson, he becomes president, and because of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Some people dispute whether or not this even happened. I'll show you a map in a little bit, but the long story short, people say that the North Vietnamese fired upon the U.S. naval ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, which allowed, in which LBJ then asked Congress to send more troops. This escalated U.S. involvement. Now you have a divided Vietnam. Here's the Gulf of Tonkin, and apparently this is where U.S. naval ships were attacked by the North Vietnamese. And of course, North Vietnam borders what? China, which borders what? The Soviet Union. It's all connected. Laos is currently communist today, and once the South Vietnamese lose, Cambodia will become communist too. We call this the domino effect. Now, before the South Vietnamese lose, let's talk about what they did. The South was run by Ngo Diem. Okay, he was a strict Catholic. He banned flags resembling Buddha. Even though this was a traditional Buddhist country, he was Catholic. He was very unpopular. The U.S. had become very involved with the war. He was actually overthrown and executed. This guy Diem, by his own generals, because he was so extreme. Even though the U.S. supported him, he wasn't the right guy for the job. The war seemed hopeless in the U.S. We sent supplies, we sent troops, we didn't enter the war, we did enter the war, soldiers were dying, people were protesting all over the U.S. I'll show some pictures of that in a little bit, and there did not seem to be an end in sight. 1973, the U.S. withdrew its troops, 58,000 killed, and 365,000 people injured, including many cocaine addictions, as you've seen in American Gangster and other movies. Here's a picture of JFK. Here's Lyndon B. Johnson. Here's the Gulf of Tonkin, and this is North Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia will be down here to the south. Remember, China is up here in the north. So, continuing on this timeline, so the U.S. public is divided over the war. College students are the biggest protesters of the war. War grows larger and larger. Draft is enacted, so people are forced to enter the military at this point once their name is selected. The U.S. is winning the war on the battlefield, but public opinion only wants it to fight a limited war. The U.S. doesn't feel like they can win fighting a limited war, especially when the North Vietnamese are using guerrilla warfare tactics. Guerrilla warfare being sneaky strategy, native knowing the land. Finishing out the Vietnam War, Johnson is very unpopular. He's so unpopular, LBJ decides not even to run for re-election. Likewise, Richard Nixon, the Republican, comes in, promises to bring the troops home. He calls this Vietnamization. He plans to withdraw the U.S. troops and train the South Vietnamese to take care of themselves. Sounds a lot like the Iraq War and some of the plans that we've seen in the last few years. Returning troops are treated with hostility by Americans. Troops are not honored, troops are not respected, they are actually spit on at airports, cussed at, etc. Nixon resigns because of his Watergate scandal where he was caught cheating. 1975, the last of the U.S. troops leave Vietnam. 1975, North Vietnam officially defeats South Vietnam. Vietnam becomes a communist country, and even though they won't officially say it, the U.S. basically lost this war. We lost this war. Alright, here's an overview. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Communist Party. He spent years in exile. Later, he returned to he organized the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh overthrew the Japanese. The Communists wanted full independence from France. They got it. America was in a tough position. Do we support the communist government or Do we support the French colonialism? Again, watch the videos on Blend Space Blackboard. We call this the domino theory. You can see one country after another is falling in Asia, and however the French were humiliated at Dien Bien Phu, which eventually they had to leave. The Geneva Accords was enacted, which would allow them to have free elections within a year. They split, Ho Chi Minh running the north, the south had elected government, Cambodia and French and Laos were set free of French imperialism. Here's, you saw China fall to communism, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia is next. These countries won't fall, but Burma eventually will. India is still democratically elected. Here's some protests in the war in Vietnam. Here's a Buddhist monk who's burned himself. I'm going to discuss this one a little bit later. He burned himself in protest because Diem, the strict Catholic of the South, outlawed any symbols of Buddha, which took away his religious freedom. Here's some protesters face to face with soldiers, probably at a college campus. Here's the fall of Saigon in 1975 when the U.S. withdrew from its embassy. We were leaving, we were departing from the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War can be often described in conflicts via pictures. Here's a South Vietnamese police chief, and he's actually executing a prisoner who was thought to be a Viet Cong captain. Viet Cong is kind of like the special forces of the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese. 1963, a Buddhist monk in Saigon actually burned himself on fire to protest the Diem regime. Diem regime was a strict Catholic, and he did not allow any symbols of Buddha to be displayed. Alright, napalm is dropped in the Vietnamese jungle by the U.S. This is now banned by the UN sanctions. Vietnamese children fleeing after the dropping of napalm. Here's the U.S. troops parachuting into Vietnam. You can see the parachutes back in the background. Again, U.S. military moving. Now, look at the Viet Cong tunnel system. I've actually had the privilege to go to Vietnam and see some of these. And you can see that there's complicated civilizations. The Vietnamese were able to pop out and to shoot Americans who are coming by. There are smoke outlets, there are breathing outlets, there's ammunition supplies, there's kitchens all underground. Vietnamese are able to move back and forth to get in and out and to hide virtually underground. This is an important part of their guerrilla tactics. So probably one of the most famous college protests of all time was at Kent State in Ohio. 4 students were killed by the National Guard, who was sent there to protect them, to protect the students. Students were throwing rocks, sure, but 2 of the students who were killed were simply walking to class. The statue of the Vietnam Memorial in D.C., I hope you get the chance to see it. Their Vietnam Wall Memorial was built in 1982 by a 21-year-old Yale student, and you can see all the names of the victims and of the soldiers who served in Vietnam. And here is a picture of it facing the Washington Monument. Now, during this time, buttons, pens became very popular, and during the protests, and again, some people wanted to get out. Again, here's the U.S. Embassy, 1975, withdrawing from Saigon, South Vietnam. Now, what did that fighting in Vietnam do? It actually helped create a genocide in Cambodia, neighboring Cambodia, because when all the fighting was taking place and people were dropping bombs in the jungle, the U.S. was actually accused of dropping bombs in Cambodia, also searching for the Vietnamese. In the midst of this chaos, a dictator rose up. His name was Pol Pot. We would discuss him temporarily. Look, this is the Cambodian symbol. This is on their flag, and this is one of the biggest religious monuments in the world. It's called Angkor Wat. It's one of the original Hindu temples, now in a Buddhist society, but one of the original Hindu temples built in one of its big cities, Siem Reap. Geography is a little bit smaller than South Oklahoma, mostly low, flat plains, somewhat in the southwest. Natural resources, oil, gas, timber, gemstones, iron, manganese, and phosphates. And you can see here's where Cambodia is today. The capital, Phnom Penh, is right there. Siem Reap is up there. Here's a history. I have the French flag, I have the Japanese flag. Why is that? Because Cambodia was colonized by both of these people, and they once had a flourishing empire under the Angkorian Empire from 802 to 1431. We talked about this. The U.S. wants to promote democracy. During the Cold War, we're trying to contain communism. And of course, our biggest rival was the USSR, which was communist. You can see the domino theory is spreading. We don't want communism to get any further. So, the Vietnam War had spilled into neighboring Cambodia. Civil war broke out, and who emerged as the leader? Pol Pot. He organized a coup d'état, an overthrow of the Cambodian government, and he called his military regime the Khmer Rouge, rouge being red and French, red being communist. So Pol Pot wanted to bring Cambodia to its original glory. Remember I talked about the Angkorian Empire where they had original glory. So he wanted to create an agrarian society where everybody was equal, everybody was a farmer. There was no educated, no wealthy, no elite. The population must, he believed, made to work and labor as in one huge federation of collective farms. So therefore, he had to kill everybody who was different. Look at this right here. Factories, schools, universities were shut down. So were hospitals. Lawyers, doctors, teachers, engineers, and scientists, professional people in any field, including the army, were murdered because if they had any recollection of the past or any knowledge of Western civilization, he did not want them. He wanted to start society, start life over, start the world over. And he actually called this time period Year Zero. So here is some human skulls representing the Cambodian genocide. Buddhist monks were also killed because in Pol Pot's agrarian society utopia, quote unquote, there was no need for organized religion. Music and radios were banned. Temples were destroyed. You could be killed for wearing glasses, laughing, or crying. One Khmer slogan ran, "To spare you is no profit, to destroy you is no loss." Here's what has become known as the Killing Fields, 1984, 1988, something like that. There's a popular Hollywood movie called The Killing Fields. I showed a brief documentary. I put it on your Blend Space Parts 1 and 2. I really encourage you to watch that to learn more about the Cambodian genocide. Cambodian genocide, 1 out of 4 people, 1.7 out of 8 people, that's 1 out of 4 were killed during the 4 years Pol Pot ruled Cambodia. The leaders of the Khmer Rouge were never brought to trial, which brings me to my next cartoon. This is Lady Justice. She's blind. She's blindfolded. Obviously Cambodia, Khmer Rouge, and Justice is blind because the leaders of the Khmer Rouge were never brought to trial. Pol Pot lived peacefully until the day he died. We are going to be doing some activities later on, and I hope you enjoyed that section. So thus far we have learned about how the Cold War started, how it affected Europe, and how it affected Asia. Now let's move over to our hemisphere and see how it affected America and Cuba. Of course, here you have the Russian bear, you have Uncle Sam. Instead of the bald eagle, you have our capitalism economy, you have their fierce military might. We're sitting on the world, we're controlling, our flags are in the background. So let's start with Cuba. Cuba was overthrown by Fidel Castro. You can see he made a relationship, a friendship with Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. Here's Cuba. Now, JFK, often seen as an attractive, handsome president, he is now seen as a fool. He is smoking a Cuban cigar and it's blown up in his face. Now, what is going on with this political cartoon? We will find out. Cuba is only 90 miles from Florida. Fidel Castro overthrew another corrupt Cuban dictator in 1959. Immediately, Castro, who was communist, became allies with the USSR. Now we are scared because communism had become very close to the American people, and it worried much of the American population, including those, especially those who lived in Florida. So, going back to this political cartoon right here, something blew up. A Cuban cigar blew up in JFK's face. Let's talk about this. This is called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy wanted to sneak in and overthrow Castro. However, on April 17, 1961, 1,400 armed Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs. That's just what it's called. The harbor is called the Bay of Pigs. The invasion was a disaster, and the United States tried to avoid involvement. They tried to look like they had nothing to do with it, but it was too late. They looked embarrassed, weak, disorganized. Again, I want you to look at the Blend Space videos on Blackboard. I want you to try to watch this when you have time, so you understand the Bay of Pigs invasion. It blew up in Kennedy's face. It embarrassed him. He looked like an immature, young, unorganized president. So, the Bay of Pigs led us to our next conflict with Cuba. 1 year later, after the Berlin Wall went up, the Soviet
the Soviet Union, who was friends with Fidel Castro, began putting long-range missiles in Cuba. Why would this worry us? Of course, because Cuba's only 90 miles away, and they could shoot long-range missiles into Virginia, into Oklahoma, into New York State, and they could bomb many American cities. The U.S. felt threatened and began negotiating with the Soviets. 63, both sides agrees to ban the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. This is mostly environmental. The Cuban Missile Crisis was 14 days. It was very extreme, very hostile, and they had missiles pointed at us. We had missiles pointed at them. The end of the world was in sight, but tensions eased and we backed away. Here you have a political cartoon of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You see each of these leaders. This is Nikita Khrushchev and JFK. They're each sitting on the nuclear weapon going the other way. His is going to the U.S., his is going to the USSR, and they are about to press the weapon to kill each other. Now, this is how intense it is. You can see they're sweating, they're playing a difficult game, and they're evenly matched. At the same time, they realize, like, oh my goodness, what we're doing is destroying the atmosphere. We're taking something that's too far. It's kind of like a jack-in-the-box that pops out, and it's very hard to put back in. They realized this monster that they had created, even though they were arch rivals, had gone too far in this arms race buildup, and they had to put a ban on the testing of nuclear weapons to protect the atmosphere that we lived in. So here's the 14 days in October, the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is now also a documentary on Netflix. Here you have Khrushchev, the Russian leader, the Soviet leader, you have JFK, and then you have Fidel Castro, who's in Cuba. They were aligned. He put missiles here pointing at us. Here's the missiles. You can see we were scared, and they could have destroyed all of this range. Kennedy blockades Cuba. U.S. moves on to Cuba. It's the big blockade. It was all over the news. People were going crazy about this story. So, picture of Fidel Castro then and now. This is when he started. He is a little bit older than this picture on the right, but his brother Raul has taken over since. Let's focus specifically about how the Cold War affected us here in America. Now, before I move forward, I want you to realize there is many internet resources that you can check out. Please look at the CNN documentary, The Cold War. You can find it on YouTube, bits and pieces. It may be available in other places as well. Here's Khrushchev and Kennedy during the early 60s. I like these two political cartoons because you have the two different theories. Here's Uncle Sam looking at the tiny bear. Here's the big bear looking at Uncle Sam. He's trying to take over these various countries. And he's looking at, this is Uncle Sam bearing down Japan, Democratic, parts of China, Pakistan, Israel, Western Europe. Now, don't get confused, because China was certainly communist, but at the time we had some influence in it. Western Europe, they seem like they're spreading communism too. So, political picture, we talked about this earlier, where two leaders face off. This is a game of chess. Here you have the Soviets and the U.S. We fear communism in a sense. The United States fears communism. The fear of communism and the threat of nuclear war affected everyday American life. During the 1950s and 60s, American schools regularly held drills to train children what to do in case of the nuclear attack, and American citizens were urged the government to build bomb shelters. This is when the development of bomb shelters and basements started to take place. Now, there was one senator. I want you to know about this guy. His name is Senator Joseph McCarthy. He played on these American fears. He scared people. He accused people. All right? He accused many people in the government and other citizens of being communists based on flimsy or no evidence. You need to know a little bit more about McCarthy. You need to know that what he did was called McCarthyism. He scared people. He had a faked letter. He had a doctored photo, which is like a photoshopped. All right, and he said, "This is tomorrow. You should fear." Basically, he hyped people up for nothing. All right, he got people worried. We call this McCarthyism. He said everybody was a communist. You're a communist. People started to accuse their own neighbor. It was mass hysteria. America during the Cold War, of course, we showed about these school drills where children were trained in case of a bomb threat. The convictions of Alger Hiss and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Now, there were some Americans who were convicted of spying for the Soviets. Americans who actually betrayed their own countries. They were later put in the death penalty, the construction of the nuclear weapons by the Soviets, using technical secrets obtained through spying. This created what's known as the Second Red Scare. The Red Scare, red being communism. We are scared of communism.
These are the people who are convicted of spying. McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare. There is a video on your Blend Space Blackboard. Now, America during the Cold War. You have to know this was a major foreign policy decision going on, and it was in every presidential election. The Cold War is brought up. The Cold War is brought up. So, I have a picture of the state of Virginia. We have money in the middle, and we're saying thanks. What's the deal with that? The heavy military expenditures throughout the Cold War benefited Virginia's economy and proportionally more than any other state. We built military bases in Hampton Roads, home to several large naval and air bases, and of course Northern Virginia, home of the Pentagon and numerous private companies such as Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Booz Allen. American military forces during the Cold War. President Kennedy pledged in his inaugural address when he was elected president that he would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe in order to ensure the survival and success of liberty. In the same address, he said, "Ask not what you can do for your country. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." Make sure you have that correct. Don't mix it up like I just did. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And I uploaded a small clip of his inaugural address. So let's talk a little bit about Americans during the Cold War. During the Cold War, millions of Americans served in the military, defended freedom in the wars that were not always popular, including Vietnam and Korea. Now we never fought the Soviets face to face. That's why we call this the Cold War. There's no actual firing of weapons, but there was other smaller wars going on in the world. Many were killed or wounded as a result of their service to the United States, and American ideals of democracy and freedom ultimately prevailed in the Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. Vietnam veterans returned. We briefly talked about this during the Vietnam section, but unlike the veterans of World War II who returned to a grateful and supportive nation, Vietnam veterans returned to often face indifference or outright hostility from some who opposed the war. It was not until several years later, at the end of the Vietnam War, that the wounds would heal and people began to recognize all the great accomplishments that they had done, the services and sacrifices they had helped us with our freedom. Now, Cold War is happening, U.S. versus Soviets. You get the picture. Soviets launch the first satellite. What does that mean? The Soviets are better at space, they're better at math, they're better at science. We get scared. Here's our response to Sputnik. Sputnik was their satellite, was the name of their satellite. Kennedy promised to put more money into math and science education. He said, you know what, they may be the first person to put a satellite in the air. We're going to be the first person to land on the moon. We succeeded when Neil Armstrong landed on July 20th, 1969. President Kennedy, who was a World War II veteran, was assassinated in 1963 before he could see the space race accomplished. This shook the nation's confidence and also created divisions for our involvement in Vietnam. Politics, you can see we kind of covered this. They wanted to focus on the Cold War. The U.S. would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, etc., to preserve the success of liberty. And it was the #1 issue of the Cold War during all presidential elections. This is a complicated section, but yet we're going to be wrapping things up for this particular section of the Cold War, because this is the ending of the Cold War and how the Soviet Union fell. Here's a symbol of the Soviet Union, and you can see it's broken up. And I believe this is Gorbachev who's going to be looking at this. Gorbachev who's going to be looking at this, seeing the broken Soviet Union that lay in ruins. Eventually, communism collapsed on itself. So, Cold War weapons, we talked about this. Here's Kennedy, here's LBJ, there's Khrushchev. They're looking at nuclear weapons. So 1963, they passed a nuclear test ban treaty. This prevented the testing of nuclear weapons. They were trying to protect the environment at this point. They didn't know if the air pollution would continue for years to come, and they knew that this just was getting out of hand. It was a monster that they could not control after a certain point. We showed this political cartoon before where they were worried that they had gone too far and they were trying to put the beast back in the box. So, Cold War weapons, they call this détente. Détente meaning the relaxation of tensions. Hey, let's get along a little bit. Here you have the bald eagle and you have the Russian bear. They start to get along a little bit. You see, they're cooperating. and it's a cartoon, so it's called The Odd Couple, and they make a baby. The baby is a dove. We're carrying the olive branch of peace. Now, things don't go that smoothly, of course, but we're trying to, break it apart and just show you what détente means. So there's a reduction of nuclear stockpiles that lasted until the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. So Mikhail Gorbachev, you always remember him because of this huge birthmark he had. People always said it looked like a bird dropping on his head, but he is known for this, for this symbol. He's a Communist Party restricted freedom. He said the Communist Party restricted freedom of speech and worship. He becomes the youngest Soviet leader at 54 years old since Stalin to take over. So, the Soviet economy was stagnant. He believed because individuals were not encouraged to act on their own. Under the communist policy, you're not encouraged to own your own business, to have your private property. There's almost no motivation. Gorbachev knew that reform needed to occur. So, here you have Gorbachev and then President Ronald Reagan. All right, they competed in military buildup for spending. Then the U.S. under President Reagan spent more than $2 trillion. Gorbachev realized the Soviets could not keep up with the spending. They could not keep up with the advancing American economy. December 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed a nuclear treaty banning certain types of nuclear missiles. Here are the two leaders. Let's talk. The summit, trying to work out their situations. He loosened the grip of Eastern Europe as the communist governments in other countries collapsed. It set the stage for the collapse of the Soviet Union. So other countries' economies began to collapse, and likewise the Soviet economy collapsed within itself. Europeans fled the economic hardships, and they started looking for opportunities in the West, similar to when you saw people fleeing into West Berlin. Collapse of the Soviet Union, the nationalism of the Warsaw Pact countries. Khrushchev had set up the Warsaw Pact, you remember this, 1955, to defend the communist bloc in NATO. Ethnic tensions and diverse populations were asserted their own identity in the Eastern Europe's economy, collapsed in the late 1980s. This is because everybody wanted something of their own. They weren't able to be this perfect communist society as planned. This led to infighting between Eastern European regions of the world and the sprouting up of various small nations. With the help of the UN, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, other new nations worked to increase trade and build economies, so now you start to see a global economy working because of the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about what Gorbachev did. He instituted two policies, glasnost and perestroika. All right, I apologize that I don't know how to say that properly. I'm sure there's a better way to say it, the proper way, but you need to know what these two things mean. Glasnost. I try to think of like clearing your nose. And what do you do when you do that? You create openness. Churches are open, books are uncensored, prisoners are released, a lot of political prisoners. Citizens are allowed to criticize economic problems. Freedom of speech. Then you have an economic restructuring. Gorbachev didn't want to get rid of communism altogether. He wanted to make the economy more efficient and productive. Soviets' turmoil and collapse. But in reforming, it led up to its breakup. Over 100 ethnic groups lived in the Soviet Union. There was a rise of nationalism in the Soviet republics. 14 of the Soviet republics who had joined the Warsaw Pact and the communist regime, majority of them living were non-Russian. They were beginning to demand self-rule. They wanted to rule themselves. They didn't want to be ruled over by the Soviet Union. A coup by the Communist Party failed in August 1991. The Communist Party collapsed. Between December 91, by December 91, all 15 Soviet republics declared independence. Soviet turmoil and collapse. 1989, Hungary allowed vacationing East Germans to cross into Austria. They could enter through West Germany. Thousands took this new escape route. East Germans began demonstrating more freedom. 1987, Ronald Reagan said his famous quote, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Berlin Wall is opened." East and West Germany are reunited for the first time since before World War II. Again, glasnost, perestroika, restructuring of the government and economy, glasnost being openness. I really like this one a lot because you start to see the Soviet Union. You see this political cartoon. These are all. This is Czechoslovakia. You have East Germany. You have Hungary, and these are the communist countries that are falling. These are the three that are left. You have China, North Korea, Cuba. Of course, there's Vietnam. Of course, there's Laos. Of course, there's Vietnam. But those aren't strong military powers. That's not what we were fearing at the time. So the artist was saying one by one they're getting, and then there were three. There was only three strong communist countries left. 1997, NATO invited Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic to join the organization. They're right there, and now they're part of NATO. This is what we call the expansion of NATO. NATO has more influence, is becoming bigger. Political cartoon. This is the giant dinosaur. It's kind of outdated. It's not working. Here's the Berlin Wall. It's crushed. It's fallen over. You can see this dinosaur has the Soviet symbol. It's saying it's done. It's extinct. And their theory of how to run government does not work anymore. Here's a famous quote when Ronald Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." People free from West Berlin, people are now able to get out, families are reunited, citizens are able to freely crush the wall, this symbol that had been in the way for so long. Bulldozers came and crushed it. NATO in the post-war. This is the expansion of NATO. Hungary and Poland joined NATO along with other countries. And all of these countries are starting to pop up. They're no longer owned by the Soviet Union. So, how did this affect that other red country over there, China? China realized, hey, we're going to have to reform a little bit too, or this is going to happen to us. There's a gap between the rich and poor, all right? It was widening. Western investments brought Western political ideas. Chinese students learned about democracy and began to question China's lack of political freedom. So in April 1989, Chinese students protested in Tiananmen Square for democracy. June 1989, just a few months later, the standoff is over. Chinese troops were killed and wounded the protester. Today, China is still communist, but citizens continue to want freedoms. Here's Tiananmen Square, a standoff, citizen standoff. They wanted democracy, but their attempt failed. And here's the goddess of democracy that people were idolizing at the time, trying to promote democracy within China.